Welcome to episode 2 in the Treasures of Public Health History with the Plague Professor series. Where did vaccines come from? Do you spend your days wondering where vaccines came from? Then listen and learn.
So today our story starts with smallpox. And if you're not familiar with smallpox, that's actually a very good thing, and it's because of vaccines. So today we're going to talk about where vaccines actually came from. But first, what is smallpox? Well, listen and learn. So this pretty picture is what smallpox looks like under a microscope. It's a virus that has a mortality rate of about 30% and often left even its survivors with really horribly disfiguring scars. But not to worry, because it was officially eradicated in 1979 because of a worldwide vaccination program. So where on earth do vaccines come from, and how did we figure this out? So you might have heard tell of a man named Edward Jenner, who is typically credited with inventing vaccines, but did he really? Well, not exactly. He's an important part of the story, but the story doesn't begin with him. So if we want to understand where knowledge of vaccines came from, we have to go back a few centuries before Jenner to China, and at least as early as the year 1000, possibly even earlier. So smallpox was well known at that point in time in China, as it was in many parts of the world. And it was also well known that people who contracted smallpox were then afterwards, after they recovered, they were immune. So they didn't necessarily understand the nature of contagion or immunity and immune systems, but they did know that people who survived it then didn't get it again. So they started thinking that maybe one way to make other people immune was to introduce a little bit of diseased material into the bodies of otherwise healthy people. And so this led to a practice called variolation that sort of took on a few different forms based on the similar principle of introducing smallpox disease matter into healthy individuals to make them immune. So one of the ways they did this was they would feed the scabs of smallpox sufferers to children in the community. So it's like, the childhood vaccination program. So that was one way. Another way was sometimes they would take the dried scabs of smallpox sufferers and smoke them. So I'm not sure how effective that particular mode of delivery was, but at any rate, it was one of them. And the third commonly practiced for a variolation was that they would actually take some pus from the sores of, I know it sounds gross, they took pus from the sores of a smallpox sufferer and introduced it just under the skin of an otherwise healthy person, with the idea then that, again, it would confer immunity. And it did, but it also carried significant risks because it could mean that the person would actually then go on to develop full-blown smallpox and die, or possibly become disfigured if they didn't die. So it wasn't perfect. It did confer immunity, but it wasn't without risk. But this was really important knowledge. And like I said, it was developed, we're fairly certain, in China. We're not exactly sure where. But this knowledge was then transferred to Europe in the 18th century through a very fancy named Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who was the wife of a British ambassador in Turkey. And so she encountered this practice, brought it back to Europe. And at first people didn't pay a whole lot of attention, but over time it kind of caught on. And then Edward Jenner, who was this English country doctor in the 18th century, kind of built on variolation and made it a little bit safer and developed what would ultimately become known as vaccination. So how did he do that? Well, he's a country doctor, so he's in the countryside. He's around a lot of dairy farms. So at that point in time, there were a lot of people known as milkmaids, these women who would milk the cows. And he started to notice that a lot of these milkmaids were seemingly immune to smallpox, that everybody else in the community was catching smallpox, but not the milkmaids. And he kind of figured out, actually I think the milkmaids figured it out, and he kind of appropriated this knowledge from them, but that they didn't necessarily catch smallpox, but they caught something from the same viral family known as cowpox that looks similar to smallpox, but it's very, very mild and it's not deadly. And
he might not have known that they were from the same viral family, but he did make the connection that these people who had cowpox never really caught smallpox. So he did an experiment where he took some pus from somebody's cowpox sores and he like scraped the skin of this little boy and put a little bit of that pus in his skin. And so the boy developed this little scar, this little cowpox scab at the site where the material was introduced. And then he was exposed to smallpox. So nothing like some good ethical standards. At any rate, he repeated this a few times, and without fail, the people who were given these cowpox inoculations didn't catch smallpox. So it took a long time for the medical community to catch on, but eventually they did. And this practice of introducing cowpox to confer immunity to smallpox became known as vaccination. Why? Because it comes from the Latin word for cow. So your vaccination is actually derived from originally using cowpox. So we don't really do vaccinations like this anymore. We don't just like pick scabs from people and then inject it into the bodies of healthy people. Fortunately, our technology has come a long way. But thanks to the Chinese who invented or who developed this practice of variolation many centuries before vaccination, we've been able to develop this technology. So instead of blaming China for coronavirus, and stop calling it the Chinese virus, viruses do not have national identities, nor do they respect boundaries. It is not the Chinese virus. It is not the Chinese virus. It is just a virus. At any rate, we owe the Chinese a debt of gratitude for actually creating this foundation of what would ultimately become vaccination. So tomorrow I will continue on. I think I want to say something more about the dangers of scapegoating. And scapegoating and disease shaming are pretty much as old as epidemics in human history. So I'm going to say more about that and just how dangerous and pervasive, in fact, in recent centuries, anti-Asian sentiment has been in characterizing epidemics and why we really need to avoid that type of disease shaming. All right, thanks for tuning in. Bye.